Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode number 10 of Nafs and Therapy. It's really, alhamdulillah, an honor that we're all on episode number 10. It feels like I've recorded episode 1 just yesterday. And today's guest is Dr. Samir Mahmoud. He is not a therapist, but he's someone who has a lot of knowledge on philosophy, psychology, and Carl Jung, Freud. And we're going to be talking about love. We're going to be talking about beauty. We're going to be talking about having a core grounded aqidah that supports you as a person and your meaning making throughout the world. And we know that we're having a meaning crisis right now. So this episode is for those who are struggling in making meaning or feel lost, or for those who don't relate to that but are interested in the beauty of what could be offered. So enjoy and let's start. Can you kind of help us understand the differences that these two characters have, and what are your thoughts on them? And if you could talk to us as if we have zero knowledge about this and we're kids in kindergarten and we're trying to learn.
Okay, so generally speaking, when we speak, and I'm speaking here from the Islamic perspective at least, when we speak about or try to approach perspectives in contemporary psychology or 20th century psychology from an Islamic lens, from an Islamic perspective, we have to bear in mind, first of all, that we are grounded in classical Islamic perspectives. We have to be grounded in our own principles and our own tradition. Why that's important is because the error I think many make is when they go straight to reading Freud or Jung or any other thinker, is they may get caught up in the discourse, the language, and find it quite convincing. And part of it is quite attractive. It's quite a powerful language. But the only way to be able to discern what is haqq and what is batil, or to be able to discern what is right or wrong, or what is truth and fact and what is not, is if one has a strong grounding in the Islamic ulum, Islamic sciences, and the Islamic tradition in general. We have a long tradition of psychology in Islam that's rooted in the Quran, it's rooted in the Hadith, and it's rooted in a very rigorous application of these core Quranic perspectives and the key theological perspectives into the realm of investigating the soul and the issues surrounding the soul and its therapy. Obviously, we have traditional medicine, also medical theory, traditional philosophy and psychology of the soul, theology of the soul, etc. So a grounding in this allows us to then approach people like Freud and Jung from a well-informed perspective, and with a set of tools that allow us to discern then what they're actually saying. In addition to that, though, and very important, this by itself is not enough. We also have to have a very solid grasp of 20th century thought and how it emerged and where it came from. What are its deep philosophical assumptions, cultural assumptions, and values? So once we have this dual knowledge, let's say, as one of my teachers says, you have to be dhu janahayn, two wings to be able to fly today. To have this knowledge of both the classical and the contemporary, you can begin to understand what's going on and where and why are these thinkers writing in the way they're writing and why they're making the assumptions they're making. So from an Islamic perspective, for example, we find that someone like Freud, who emerges out of a late 19th century European tradition of investigating the depths of human interiority, the depths of the human self. It's a long tradition. It's been going on in Europe for centuries. But if you look at the gradual development of these traditions in Europe of exploring human subjectivity, you discover that along the way, a lot of assumptions are being made that are not consistent with our Quranic and our Islamic tradition. And that leads to the setting up of psychological models of the self, the human being, that are problematic. So, for example, in Islamic tradition, we have an understanding that the human being, like existence, so the human being and existence both consist of multiple levels, maratib al-wujud, and we have at the pinnacle of our, or the innermost reality of our essence is a ruh, a spirit, and when that spirit embodies in a body and commingles with it, that commingling is called the soul, the nafs, and so the nafs straddles the essence, which is the ruh, and the body, which is the physical, material conduit that we occupy during this brief lifetime on earth. And we realize that our essence is actually the ruh, and our journey is to actualize whatever fitraic or fitra seeds that have been implanted within us as we come into this world. And the whole journey of life is to unfold these seeds in order to realize our full potential as khulafa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth. So to realize the tahqiq of al-insan al-kamil, the complete human being.
So that's kind of the purpose of why we're here as a
Absolutely.
unity, or as a
Absolutely.
collective.
Once you have this understanding, what's within this model of the soul or the model of the self, there is a ruh, a nafs, jasad, and then within that there is the five senses. We have the aql, we have qalb, we have the lower nafs and other aspects of the nafs. So even the nafs has multiple levels. And yes, we have lower instincts and desires, but the lower instincts and desires aspects of our embodied existence. And while they serve an important purpose, they can't be the governing authority within this world or microcosm that we call the human being. But often when people and human beings do forget their spiritual origin, their source, and they kind of sink deeper and deeper into the material instincts and drives and the requirements of satisfying them, they become, let's say, servants of it. They become almost exclusively driven by it. And these drives and instincts become the latent forces that drive and motivate much of the decisions we make.
Similar to what Freud thinks.
Yes, but this is the point I'm trying to make. But in the Quran, this is the state of, the Quran talks about خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم, but also, in the most perfect of forms, but the human being can fall to أسفل سافلين. So what Freud is describing when he talks about the sexual drive as the most fundamental latent drive that ultimately drives all other motivation forces in the soul, he's actually describing the state of a, let's say, fallen human being, an insan who has sunk deep into the level of existing in purely instinctual bodily satisfaction. But the Islamic tradition also talks about a higher aspect of ourself, which is rooted in the ruh, which is rooted in the fitrah, and that is ascending rather than being carried down by the weightiness of the body and the material drives and instincts. Its actually center of gravity is not centered in the body, but it's centered higher up in the levels of the nafs, high up in a level of consciousness we call the qalb. And so it is lightweight and it floats upwards, and it, upon its mi'raj, its vertical movement. If we miss this, and which is what Freud does, because Freud, is he has this lens in which he's looking only at a material existence. Freud was an atheist, of course, and he rejected all metaphysical speculation on all aspects of the metaphysical world and the spiritual world. And gazing with his lenses low at the level of the subterranean, murky, nebulous realm of the instincts and drives, he thought that's all there is to the human being, and he described that. Now, he described that with great accuracy, but what he was describing is the human being who, as the Quran describes, مَنْ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Right? The Quran criticizes those who take their hawa, their desire, as their deity, the God that drives their journey through life. So insofar as he was describing that, he was accurate. His problem was to think that that's all there is to the human being, and therefore he'd solved the problem of what it is to be human and what it is to be civilization, right? Because he believed that ultimately even the loftier expressions of civilization, like music and art, and also actually sublimated sexual instincts and drives. So yes.
Right. And you could add this point, and I'm gonna ask about something else as well.
Yeah. So is Freud? People often ask me, is Freud right or wrong? What do you think? Well, he's wrong. Essentially, he's wrong because he doesn't have the whole picture, and it's deeply fundamentally flawed. But if you look at him in a more, let's say, understanding way and say, he's actually looking at insan, a human being who is mired deep at a very low materialistic level of existence, cooped up within the circularity of those drives and instincts, which is dark, it's murky, and it's subconscious. It is subconscious because the instincts and drives operate at a level below the level of consciousness. But Freud is not aware, nor is he interested in what's above consciousness, which is supraconsciousness, right? That metaphysical
Hmm.
spiritual realm where we can ascend actually to higher degrees of consciousness, overcome the pull of the lower nafs, nafs al-amara bis-su, and actually
Hmm.
be masters over it rather than being servants of it. So insofar as he's describing someone who lives only at the level of a nafs al-amara bis-su, he's describing something quite interesting and accurate. The problem is he
Hmm.
thinks the human being is only a nafs al-amara bis-su. That's the problem.
Hmm. I see. And he and Jung were friends for quite a long time, I remember, and they've had their differences. And if we want to hear a bit more from you on the perspective from Carl Jung, who talked about individuation, he talked about becoming who you are, and he talked about the concept of the collective unconscious. And we also in Islam we have these concepts of tahqiq al-nafs, or realizing one's true nature, the ones that you've also talked about briefly now. Do you think these are parallel? Do we have more similarities with Carl Jung than with Freud? And can we get something his writings and his thoughts?
Okay, so Jung is very different from Freud. I mean, he was his chief disciple for many years, and they
Mm,
had a fallout at the early 20th century because Jung essentially couldn't accept Freud's reduction of all of the libido, of the drive of the inner life of the soul as a purely sexual one. Jung libido is a spiritual energy. It's an energy within that could be channeled in the sexual drive, but it could be channeled in other directions, including loftier, higher directions of realization. So, in that sense, then the human being is not reducible to that material sexual drive. And the human being, and for Jung also, contrary to Freud, religion is not an illusion as it was for Freud. An infantile kind of hangover from a young age. It's not a result of projection necessarily. For Jung, religion and most religions were essentially forms of consciousness or conduits for the development of human consciousness that could elevate the human being on a path towards full realization and what he calls individuation. So he has a much more charitable view of religion, a much more serious one, even though a lot of theologians were very critical of his ideas. Because as a psychologist, he kept on insisting that he was only describing what he could see in the psyche. And he never made a claim as to what exists outside the psyche. So he could never say, does God exist or not exist? And so he wasn't interested in theology, metaphysics, and all that kind of stuff. And this is where a lot of criticism of Jung comes from, because while he was a lot more charitable towards religions and religious traditions, and he studied them quite extensively, especially esoteric traditions, alchemy, Eastern religions, etc. And he had an interesting relationship to Islam also. But he has this more charitable attitude toward religion. But the problem is that because of his anti-metaphysical stance and his avoidance of theology and his rejection to make any claim beyond the psyche, he fell into a number of problematic positions, epistemic positions. And that's why a lot of the criticism comes in his direction. However, if you look at him more charitably, and say, well, okay, in spite of Jung and the limitations of his perspective, is there something that I can benefit from and learn from in him? He has a lot more to offer than Freud does in that sense. And he looked at religions as depositories of not only wisdom, but very profound symbols. Now, a theologian would say these symbols come from the beyond, from the
mm,
higher spiritual realms. Jung used a different language. For Jung, what a religious person would call the beyond or the spiritual realm or the transcendental world, Jung would call the collective unconscious, the unconscious, right? And now that's a problematic term because in the same realm called the unconscious, he dumped all religious symbols and also heaven and hell and the darker realms of the psyche and the more luminous realms of the psyche. So he mixed them all together into a realm that was quite undifferentiated or non-differentiated. And so, whereas in a traditional perspective, you would have the realm of light above, and then below there would be the darker realm of the shadow or evil, or let's say the lower nafs. Jung just called everything beyond consciousness one single heap called the unconscious or the collective
mm,
unconscious. And that's problematic. Now, if you can kind of say, well, okay, how can I navigate some of these problematic definitions he has and try to kind of redefine them or reinterpret them more charitably? There's a lot that can be benefit from, because he has a very interesting understanding of the way in which religious symbols operate within the psyche. He has a very interesting understanding of how certain fundamental archetypes, for example, guide the unfolding of human individuality over time, i.e. the realization of the self over time. He believed that at the heart of the human psyche, there was a thing called the self. And he identified this self with what he called the God image. Basically, your highest real essential reality is the self, which is identical with divinity within you.
Oh, wow. That's powerful. It's
Yeah.
taking me a second to absorb. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, he didn't invent it. You know, he used a very rich psychological language to talk about it. But this is something that's found in the esoteric and mystical traditions across Europe. Yeah. So he didn't. But what he was doing was kind of translating a lot of the insights he found in the esoteric tradition, in the mystical tradition, in the alchemical tradition, into a language of 20th century psychology and science, partly influenced by Freud, partly influenced by his study of comparative religion, partly influenced by the development of psychology as a science, medical terminology. And he kind of came up with a science of the soul, which is distinct from the psychoanalysis or the psychoanalytic tradition that Freud, but both adept psychologies in the sense that they both look um, um, beneath the level of consciousness for much of what defines the trajectory of human existence in this world. You know, Jung spent a considerable amount of time looking at alchemy, and part of that alchemy was the alchemical tradition in Europe was largely influenced by Arabic alchemy, Islamic alchemy. Jung's father knew Arabic, and he was a scholar of Semitic studies. So he was well versed in some of the Eastern Abrahamic religions like Islam. And later in life, you know, Jung came in contact with Islam directly through a number of interesting scholars. And he wrote a very short psychological commentary on Sut al-Kahf. So I've written on this a lot before. I convened one of the earliest international symposia on Jung and Islam many years ago in Beirut, at AUB.
Wow, I had no idea. Okay.
And we're editing right now a special journal on Jung and Islam coming out in December. Now, people often ask me, why are you so interested in Jung in that sense, right? And yes, Jung has his problems and has his errors, but if you're able to identify the metaphysical problems and errors and theological ones, and then you ask yourself, what's left that I can benefit from? There's a good amount that's beneficial still. One can't say the same about Freud. Once you've torn through Freud, you're not left with that much. At least in my opinion. I think has a bit more to offer, a lot more to offer for any serious person who is interested in what can I benefit and integrate into my own Islamic perspectives, but on my own terms. That's the important thing. Because often people engage in dialogue with other thinkers, but they end up capitulating and falling into the trap of buying into their discourse and their assumptions, and they end up distorting Islam and Islamic psychology in the process. It has to be very careful.
Yeah, exactly, which is what I wanted to ask, that you can get a lot from that doesn't really contradict much of the core Islamic principles that one is holding. And I don't know if you realize this or notice this a lot in your work, but I see this with people around me who I know you have like a really, mashallah, passion for traditional texts and for writings and for discussing these ideas and the texts that you read. How many books do you read, Dr. Samir, in a month?
I'm what they call a bookworm.
And you know, for the laid back people, like the ones that that are therapists or even patients, there's this like kind of step away from the readings and from being so involved in whether the metaphysical world or from like, you never study this anywhere in school in my psychology degree or anything. But how do you personally maintain that sense of wonder of this like intellectual journey that you're in, and how can we, like the laid back people, kind of rekindle this?
Well, you're asking. I mean, I was speaking to someone recently. I belong to a generation that was just before the internet, before mobile phones, before computers, right? So I grew up in a period where books is all that we had, all I had. I mean, yes, there were TVs and whatnot, but so maybe it's a bit easier for me because I grew up reading a lot, extensively, and I don't think there's any alternative to reading. People say I read a lot online. People tell me I read online articles, I listen to podcasts and whatnot. It's not the same thing. Sitting comfortably and in the zone with a book for hours allows you to sink into a level of consciousness that skirting the surface of websites and articles and podcasts just simply does not allow. They're very important, these, as means of disseminating knowledge in a certain way, but it can't be the core of how you form your knowledge in the first place. Recently, speaking to a friend, I suggested that they read a page a day and then they increase it every week until they get to 50 a day, 50 pages a day. That'll amount to a good number of books a year. But you have to have this passion for ilm and knowledge. People are different. People have different temperaments and different interests and different dispositions and whatnot. So it works differently with different people. I read 3, 4 different books simultaneously at the same time. That's how my brain works. Some people can't read except more than a book at a time. Right. But if you really, one way of igniting, and I was doing a hike recently with a group of brothers and sisters, and we were looking at nature and the water, and I said, if you really look at the world around us as direct manifestations of divine actions and attributes, and everything around us as literally signs which we are drowning in, the Muslim must be the one who is the most interested in studying the world around us in depth. We should be the ummah of knowledge in that sense. So I think maybe perhaps freshening the way we look at things in the world around us may ignite that passion.
I agree. And it kind of takes me to a similar question that I wanted to ask, and I feel it fits perfectly here, which is this crisis of meaning, the meaning that we're making about our lives, about what's happening with us, about our circumstances, even though there's so many content and opinions and all of that around the world, but I notice that we lack depth sometimes, and maybe that's what you're also referring to, that isn't this much depth. But how can we cultivate this depth in one way where we're just not stuck on the surface, and we just, like you mentioned something about meaning early on in the first question about the meaning of us being here as khulafa, and I'm unsure if there's a way to formulate it for as well for a laid back listener who's struggling with finding meaning in his life or her life.
Well, the question of, as a Muslim, the question of meaning shouldn't be really a question in the first place. And if it is, it means there's a significant, there's a problem in the way in which we're practicing our deen. Yesterday in Sydney, I gave a full day workshop on the meanings of prayer. Asrar al-Salat. It's a course that I've taught before at the CMC. And people were surprised to find out that there was something deeper beyond the actual movements of the prayer. Why? Because it has to do with the fact that we weren't taught this when we were children. So we did a workshop on how we can connect to the deeper meanings of prayer and how it relates to. So our deen, often, one of the problems today in which we're raised as young Muslims is we're not raised with a love for the deen sometimes and a proper education of how that deen plays out as defining the trajectory and the roadmap for our lives. And without that proper education and grounding, we often find ourselves lost in the myriad discourses out there. A sister yesterday was telling me she reads, she's not raised with a religious education, and she reads all these books about reincarnation and this and that and this and that, and she finds them convincing. And we spent a few minutes speaking, and she realized quickly that, in actual fact, she only finds them convincing is because she's got no foundation. She's no foundational knowledge whatsoever. And without any foundational knowledge and a moral intellectual compass, anyone tells you with some degree of conviction and some structure may sound convincing. So the foundational aspect of ilm becomes extremely important for allowing us to navigate in this world of so many different perspectives and so many different ideas. Sometimes the crisis of meaning is not because there's no meaning, it's because we have no clue or no way of actually settling on any particular one. Right? Sometimes it's like the classic problem in multicultural theory. Sometimes when you have no clear moral and ethical standards and reference point, any ethical position becomes relatively equal. It's one of the problems of postmodernism. Postmodernists can't really tell which is right, which wrong, morally wrong. And they say, okay, to each their own. And they call this tolerance. It's not really tolerance. It's we accept all perspectives because we don't know what is right and what is wrong. And so they must be equally valid or equally invalid. And the same thing with meaning. People who are not rooted properly get confused with all these narratives about what meaning, the purpose of life is, because they simply have no roots. And if they did have roots, proper roots growing, there wouldn't be a problem, an issue. And I find this increasingly the source of the problem of meaning for many youth. There's no roots, there's no foundation, and they haven't been formed or raised in this way of looking at things. And then by the time they get to university and they're exposed to all these different perspectives, they don't know what is right, what is wrong, what is correct, what is false. And then they end up, I don't know, la adriya, agnosticism. Because you can be an agnostic in regards to God by saying, I don't know if God exists or not. But agnosticism also could be, I don't know what meaning there is, what purpose there is, and so forth. Therefore, I get lost adrift the different currents that take me this way or that. Its roots and solid foundations are extremely important.
How can someone start like seeing again or start? And I've heard this from some people who tell me I've read all of the texts, like I've read the whole Quran. I've done my research. It just doesn't sit well with me, and I just can't accept the idea that there's someone who's going to go to heaven and someone who's going to go to hell, and all of that. Um, so for those who were exposed to the texts, or maybe it's their own exploration without a teacher, what would you recommend for someone who wants to see again or who wants to learn again and is at university?
Wallahi, a number of ways of responding to this question, but Imam al-Ghazali provides a template, a model.
Mm.
Imam al-Ghazali says, look, you can study and read as many books as you want. Some of them will satisfy the intellect, some of them may not. Because if you keep on reading, you might always come across an argument that will counter the argument you were convinced of last week. And then you end up in a circle where, argument, and you end up nowhere. Yes, good books and knowledge through reading text can produce a certain degree of certainty, but the only type of real certainty without any wavering or without any doubt can only come from a direct experiential realization, right? You and I can argue endlessly about whether honey is sweet or not, but if you've tasted it, I can't deny you that experience anymore. No argument can actually counter what you've experienced. And Imam al-Ghazali suggests that for those who want that certainty, they have to taste the lazza, the joy of faith and iman. They have to taste the lazza of prostrating their head on the prayer mat. They have to taste it for themselves. And there's no two ways about it. But to taste it, you have to do this to experience that. Al-Ghazali says one of the biggest problems with some people is they will deny that adhkar and salat and certain practices will lead to certain experiences. They'll deny it without trying it. But you cannot rationally accept or reject this. You can only accept or reject it is if you try it and it fails. So like any experiment that a scientist does, you can only invalidate the outcome or the results as if you replicate the experiment and it doesn't produce the same results. And so Imam al-Ghazali encourages people, and he says, okay, he charts a path. And in the Ihya and in the Munqidh min ad-Dalal, he says, do 1, 2, 3, 4. And he basically, it's a regimen, it's a kind of like a small program for doing dhikr and ibadah and taqwa and hudur al-qalb and adhkar and khalwa and certain practices for a certain period of time. And then he says, if the transformations don't begin to happen, and they always do, then you can deny it. And the problem with a lot of people is that they'll say, and this is again a result of jahl, because in the Islamic tradition, there's an interesting thing about different types of knowledge and different types of critique. You can't, if you want to deny an experiment, you got to deny it through experiment. If it's a rational argument, then you deny it through a rational argument. If someone is saying that this dawa, this medicine, has this healing effect, you can't just sit and pontificate and say, I don't think that is the case. If you try it, and if it doesn't heal, a burn on the skin, then you can deny it, right? So in the realm of meaning, the realm of purpose, the realm of individuation, let's call it, to borrow a term from Jung, in the realm of, these are realms of experiential realization that involves knowledge, but knowledge that becomes realized through experience. No amount of sitting back in your chair denying it will get you anywhere. They get down and try it or not. People often say, well, I prayed before and I haven't had any experience. And Ghazali's response would be very simple from his Ihya Ulumuddin. You haven't done the salat with ihsan and hudur al-qalb, ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarah, but you've been through the motions. And the Prophet ﷺ says in many hadiths, there are people who pray who get nothing from their prayer except a view of the Qibla wall and some movements. Right? A good exercise. So I think if people are really serious about this, and I know especially these days, youth, because of the way we're brought up and we're trained in school, we're told to use our critical mind and analysis paralysis, and we end up being always saying, convince me before I do something. The problem is many of the youth are not equipped sufficiently enough with the knowledge or the intellectual capacity sometimes to understand the answers, nor are they willing to pursue the knowledge to be able to understand the answers. But real commitment in this domain requires a commitment of action. No amount of argument. Like if you give you an example of climbing a mountain, you can't pontificate about it. You can't say, okay, convince me that it's a meaningful, purposeful journey. It doesn't work that way. Come, let's go on the journey together and you'll see and taste what it does to you, right? Meaning and purpose are not here up in the head, not abstract ideas and concepts. They live realities. And people often approach it from the wrong angle. And there's various ways of approaching a specific subject, but I wanted to highlight this one because I get a lot of it. I work a lot with youth, and I start really very simply. I say, let's go for a hike. I have a deen crisis, mana crisis, meaning crisis. Khalas, okay, forget about all that. Let's go for a hike. What do you like doing? We like hiking. Let's go hiking. And then in the midst of experience, in the mix of experiencing the beauty and the jamal of God's beautiful nature and the hearing and listening of the trickling of the water and the sun as it shines through the leaves and the canopy of the trees, in that kind of powerful experiential moment is when the alchemical stuff begins to happen properly. If you sit with someone in a chair and it's head to head, convince my intellect and give me an argument, it doesn't work. But if you meet people wherever they are in the thicket of life, that's what Prophet ﷺ did. I find that very useful. And I find the source of their problems are not what they're telling me it is. It's something completely different. Ibn Ghazali says in the Munkars bin al-Dalal, he says, the source of so much intellectual confusion and doubt is not intellectual at all. It's spiritual. It's an ailment of the soul. And if you touch it, a lot of the intellectual questions dissipate and disappear. There's a facade, there's a veneer of, especially in a rational culture like ours, there's a facade and a veneer that it's not making sense, or I have intellectual doubts, or I'm skeptical. But usually that is an outcome of something that is not intellectual in origin, but soulful, deep in the soul.
Oh wow, that's really powerful, and it reshapes the way of how could we approach it instead of saying it's a
Beauty
thinking problem. Good. You
is
said
the most
beauty.
effective way of doing that.
And I think
Yeah.
we have a bit more time where I could ask you this, because I've listened to your lecture, or I think it was about love, but I don't remember where it was. It was posted maybe a couple of weeks back, and you mentioned some really interesting things about love and how many times it was mentioned in the Quran in different ways, in different forms. And I first want to ask you, what do you think love really is from a metaphysical or Islamic, even
Well,
philosophical perspective?
love is not a thing. Love is a relation.
Okay.
It's a relation. It's a force between things. And there's one thing that evinces love, that triggers love, that causes love. That's beauty. Beauty is a quality of things. Love is not a quality of things. It's a relation between things. It's a force between things. So you look at a beautiful person and you're drawn towards that person. That force, that eros, as the Greeks called it, that force is called love. But love is a relation. So there can never be any love except in the presence of beauty. And if you look across the board, it applies. Between human beings, you find the person either outwardly or inwardly or both beautiful, and that draws you towards it, right? It's instantaneous. Art, the same. So beauty is that quality which, when perceived, evinces in the beholder an attractive force we call love. Now, if you take this model
Uh-huh.
and apply it across, you'll find that it applies. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He loves His abd. For example, when you perform your nawafil, the performing of nawafil and the performing of spiritual excellence of our ibadah is ihsan. And ihsan, al-hasan wal-husn, the good and the beautiful are related to ihsan. So these meanings are interconnected, right? I translate ihsan as being beautiful. People translate it as spiritual excellence. I translate it as being beautiful. When you become beautiful in that sense, then God loves you. And when He loves you, then, He becomes the ear with which you hear, the eyes with which you see, etc. Scholars tell us that Allah created the world out of His rahmah and His love for the beauty of His own divine names that have yet to manifest. The divine names are called what in the Quran? Asma'ullah al-Husna, the most beautiful names. Because beauty, which is associated with rahmah, beauty is a quality of creation itself. The ulama say everything in creation is intrinsically beautiful. If you look at the classic way in which scholars divided the divine names, the divine asma' al-jalal wa asma' al-jamal. But scholars say, in actual fact, all divine names are beautiful, and beauty of divine names. So we have divine beauty. Underneath it, then, we have the qualities of jalal and jamal. God's majestic essence is shielded by His beauty, which shines outwardly, because we cannot bear the absolute majesty of God. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifests through His most beautiful names, not directly to His essence, but His beautiful names, and that shields us from the fullness of that majesty of the divine essence that we cannot bear. Right? So beauty is a reigning property of things in the world. Jamal mutlaq. Everything is intrinsically beautiful. Now, when we see a beautiful thing and we call it beautiful, they say هذا جمال على جمال. But things are intrinsically beautiful. Now, al-urafa, al-arifin, al-awliya, etc., they're able to perceive the intrinsic beauty of all things, even what conventional society may call ugly, because everything is intrinsically beautiful. But if you think about the divine names as being the most beautiful names of God, and the divine names directly manifest their traces in creation, then everything is beautiful. And potentially everything, which is everything that is beautiful, because everything is a manifestation of divine names. So everything in creation can evince love within us that draws us back to God. Yani Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His infinite rahmah, has projected the overwhelming attribute and quality of beauty in all things as a rahmah for us, because we ultimately are drawn back to Him through it. Even for those who reject Him. People go to nature. Why do they go to nature? Why do they go to the sea? Why do they go forest bathing? Muslim, non-Muslim, atheist, non-atheist, everyone loves nature, right? What they don't realize, and the believer does, is they're really actually only really in love with God. Right? They may not see that the outward beauty of nature is a manifestation of the beauty of the divine, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala projects that beauty because it evinces love that draws us back to Him. But they say God created the world through love of the beautiful things before He creates them. They come into this world, and their intrinsic beauty is what draws them back to Him. Come back to me, my servants. And we're drawn back with the force and power of that love and ascend back to Him. So at a metaphysical level and ontological level, that's what beauty, that's what its fundamental function is. That's why all the Anbiya possess a high degree of beauty in one form or another. Some of it outward, some of it more inward, some of it whatever it is, but in their actions, in their moral integrity, etc., beauty is what draws people back. And the Prophet ﷺ manifests perfect balance between the inward and outward beauty in his own paradigmatic nature.
I think I have two follow-ups on this. Um I'm not I really like I really like the way you framed it. I'm but maybe struggling in seeing how this can be universal, like or how so when we think of beauty, then there should not be certain standards to what we should consider beautiful or not, or that has
Well,
beauty?
the thing is, in the ancient world, they used to make a distinction between two types of beauty, which we don't do today anymore. There's objective beauty and there's subjective beauty. Bimana. There are things that are intrinsically beautiful in an objective sense, which all human beings can assent to universally, like nature. There is a single person on the planet that would say nature is ugly. It's rooted in human fitra, it's rooted in human universality. But there are also types of beauty that are more subjectively determined or culturally constructed. For example, certain cultures may prefer the color red or yellow or green for whatever reason. Some individuals may have a certain preference for this or that because of certain upbringing. So there are subjective or more culturally, socially constructed notions of beauty, and there are universal ones that are objective. In most ancient cultures, they did their art and architecture as a mix of both. But usually the objective beauty or the standards of objective beauty were much more overwhelming than the more culturally, socially subjective ones. Let me give you an example. Today, if you go to Paris, you see a Gothic cathedral, or you go to Japan and you see a Shinto temple or Buddhist temple. You, as Noura, can recognize that they're both very beautiful. But there may be certain aspects that are culturally specific, like the type of roof they have in Buddhist temples and its minimalism, or the statuary, the statues that you find in the Gothic cathedral, which is Catholic, that you may or may not have a kind of an inclination towards. But nonetheless, you can recognize a certain degree of universal beauty in both. And in the ancient world, they used to derive their standards of what was beautiful from nature itself. So if God created the world and created it beautiful and it is perfect, then when I build or make something, I derive the standards and the criteria for beauty from the beauty of God's creation. So, for example, the Greeks, they built their temples according to the ratios, proportions of harmony found in the natural world, right? And that's why we can, universally we find that, there's a certain degree of beauty there. But the angular nature of the entablature, for example, or the pediment and the structure and the columns, while the proportions are universally recognizable as beautiful, the specifics are very Greek, culturally Greek. What happened by the 19th century in Europe especially is objective beauty was almost thrown out the window. And by the 20th century, we get this emphasis on subjective beauty. We don't talk about objective beauty anymore. And the problem with subjective beauty is if everything you make and do is based purely on the subjective criteria of beauty, then you're going to produce a lot of things that some people find beautiful and nice, and a lot of people find ugly. Why? Because you're not rooting it in that which is universally accepted as beautiful, right? That's why modern architecture and postmodern architecture and art has produced a lot of ugliness. So yes, there are objective beauty and there is subjective beauty and there are different criteria of beauty, but rest assured that if, and this is a fact, everyone finds nature beautiful, then we do have a very solid criteria for what is considered to be universally beautiful. And you can derive from that standards and criteria for doing art and architecture, which is what most of the people in history have done. And, Ibn al-Haytham, one of the great Muslim scientists and opticians, used to say in one of his texts on optics, he used to say, beauty is part of the fitrah, and recognizing it is part of the fitrah. But not only that, he says, as a child whose fitrah hasn't been corrupted yet can distinguish between something that is beautiful and something that is ugly. Not only that, if you put two beautiful things in front of them, they can distinguish that which is more beautiful than the other. And he, of course, Ibn al-Haytham subscribes to, what many of the ancients did, which is the idea that by deriving your standards of beauty and criteria of beauty from the intrinsic beauty of the natural world that God created, you can have very objective standards for beauty that are universally recognizable.
It's a new lens of seeing it for me. It's a lens that requires as well a lot of intention and mindfulness when we're talking about it. And I think I want to wrap up the session or the podcast today with one question about love that I think you've hinted about love. Yeah. I think you've eased through it, but so love for you is not this thing, but it's more this relationship that you have with beauty, right? Did I capture it correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and we know that in modern ways of presenting love, it's more corrupted and more, it's very, very maybe linked with the lower desires and nafs. And we see ways of portraying love, whether in movies or in everywhere, that are pretty different than right now what we're talking about from a
Mm.
more Islamic philosophical perspective. So my question here, I think, lies of if you think that this love or this true love, whether it's divine or human even, does it require a certain level of dissolving or a dissolution of the ego? And how can
Yes.
we
So
like really differentiate
yeah.
between a love that consumes and a love that deceives us?
Yeah, so there are different types of love and different degrees of love. You know, in the Arabic language, you have over
Mm,
20 words for love. Some scholars have written entire texts on this subject, pointing out which types of love are adequate between humans and which are only adequate between humans and God. They shouldn't be between humans. So ishq is often, which is a very intense form of love, is considered hubb, yani, is considered to be something that is only appropriate with divine. And at the highest level of love, you have al-huyaman, al-huyam. You know, the Arabic word name, hiyam or huyam, is one of the highest degrees of love. And you may know the Hadith al-Qudsi about how there's a category of angels Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created when He first created the world, who are circling the throne. They are so enraptured in love that they haven't noticed that He created the world because they're drunk in divine love. They're, circulating the Kaaba, sorry, the house. So, yes, love is in various degrees and it has different stages, and we don't have time to get into it, but perhaps a separate podcast on love on its own. But
mm,
essentially, the more intense love becomes, the more one leaves, let's say, their individual ego, or at least they begin to dissolve this idea that the ego is a separate thing. And they begin to melt away into the other. As I said, love is that force that draws you towards something else that's beautiful. So love is that force that draws you out of yourself into what they call a takhallul al-mahbub. You become permeated and almost interpenetrate the very reality of the other. That's why Ibrahim was called Ibrahim al-Khalil. Khalil, right? Takhallul is means when you kind of intermingle with the other out of an excessive passionate love for the other. And then where through various degrees of abandoning the egotistical claims and selfish interest, you become obsessed with realizing the desires of the other over your own until you completely merge with that other, that beloved. Now, in some of the literature, they say, one has to be careful not to reach this degree of love or excessively in relationship to another human being, but this should pertain between the human being and God. And there's an interesting perspective here to consider, which is that in the absence of God in the lives of people, people may wrongly project a love relationship that is supposed to be vertical. They may project it horizontally on another person. And inevitably, other human beings cannot bear the weight of that projection and they will disappoint. And it leads to a lot of heartbreak. So it's something to really,
oof.
really keep in mind
Mhm,
that when we abandon God, that vertical axis that's supposed to connect us to God, we end up directing it, trying to direct it and isqata, yani, to kind
mhm,
of project it onto worldly equivalents and the worldly equivalents that are not made to bear this particular type of projection and relation will fail. And with failure, that failure comes a lot of heartbreak. So yes, love is ultimately, because it draws things to each other, it dissolves the boundaries between things, and you begin to get a taste for that unity between things that were otherwise separate. And that union, Ibn Hazm has a wonderful treatise on love, where using an old Platonic image, the primordial human being was created as male and female, kind of in a single circle. And then the circle was cut in half into half male, half female. And then in life, we search for that other half. Why? Because to become complete. And
mhm.
how do these two pieces come together? Love is that force of gravity that brings them together, right? And so we become whole. But when we become whole, we dissolve that ego, definitely. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's a lot that
And
can be
this
said about this
reminds
topic.
me.
It's a huge topic.
Yeah,
It's a
we need to
beautiful
do
one.
another episode just for it. And because I loved the session that you've done on it with the group I think they were university students, if I'm not mistaken. It was so meaningful for me, even the fine
The
of
recent retreat, yes, okay, yeah, now I
yes.
know what you're referring to. Yes, we did that.
Yeah. And what you just said as well reminds me of the book, Perfect Love, Imperfect Relationships. I'm not sure if you recommended it for us. Do you remember it? I think you're going to be proud of us because my cohort started a reading club after our time ended with CMC, and we started reading a book every couple of months, and we finished around like maybe 3 or 4 books so far together, which was really
MashaAllah.
beneficial, reading and having sahba. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for your time today. I know we've hit the time, but one maybe last thing that I'd love to ask from you is, and I know this is going to sound so simple with everything that we've talked about, but especially when it comes to love, if you have an advice for the novice, for the laid back, for the ones who are struggling in this world, what would you tell them?
You mean love in terms of in a relational sense with other?
Yeah, especially when you mentioned right now that sometimes we would project this that's supposed to be a divine love, we project it on humans, and when we abandon God.
I
So
suppose maybe one piece of advice that comes to mind, which is something that I was dealing with recently with someone, is only in a very healthy relationship that one has with God can one have a really healthy relationship with their partner. Because if you're embarking on your journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are directing the kind of libido, and libido here I mean energy, right? You are directing the right kind of energy within you in a vertical direction. And you are directing the right kind of energy in the direction of that horizontal relationship with the other person. Having one without the other is problematic and can have devastating consequences on relationship. Without a vertical relationship where you feel like a lot of validation, a lot of meaning, a lot of purpose, and a lot of that love, unconditional love that comes from the unseen towards you, you're going to expect it and demand it from the other who cannot give it. Right? And without a relationship with an other, you will struggle in that vertical relationship. That's why the Deen recommends that marriage is half the Deen, because it is in that working relationship with the other person that we tangibly touch on the concrete meaning of love with another human being who can become a symbol of that relationship with the divine. But also, love isn't just what we call a lovey-dovey thing. Love is also a struggle and a journey in which the constant refinement of the self increases the intensity of the love. It's like a fire. Fire burns all things that are inessential around it. And that flame of love burns all those things that are inessential. And so but it is in the crucible of that fire and the refinement of the self that one يتدرج, you ascend into higher and higher degrees of love. People often they make the confusion that love is that people often make the confusion of infatuation or intense desire for another person as love, right? That's not love. If we had gone through, or if we had time, we'd go through different degrees. But at the lowest level, you have desire and instinct, which is usually linked with sexual gratification and infatuation. People often confuse that for love. It's not love. And a lot of people have lived their whole life and haven't actually experienced that love. But to move from degree of love to higher degree of love, even love of another human being, requires a tadarruj, a gradual movement in an upward direction. But that can only happen when both are working on intensifying those elements of self-beautification that intensify that love towards the other. Right? That's why when we say a beautiful mu'amala between the husband and the wife or the partners increases that love over time, it's very true. Right? One of the things that scholars always talk about is love is never something you can satiate. It never reaches its object.
I love that.
It never reaches its object, at least with another human being. It always something that there's another shade of it, and there's another degree of it, an intensity of it. But only in that vertical relationship can you fully satisfy it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so not having that balance between the vertical and horizontal could be detrimental.
Wow, this is so beautiful. This is so beautiful and so deep, and I think it leaves us come in a place of reflection. So thank you so much, Dr. Samir, for your time and all of the beautiful insights. I'm gonna as well look for the papers that could be interesting, and I'm gonna link them in the show notes, inshallah. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Very nice to see you again. And thank you for the listeners for listening in.